Welcome to the next video for the PRP Academy. This video is about specifically the profitability matrix. So it's what we use to, separate the relevant areas of profit. So these are the inputs: sales, COGS, wages, variable overhead, and rent, and operating profit is the output. So when you normally get a P&L, it's often very long, it's not grouped. So we like to present it in this form as a summary view, which can be expanded on, and we put that all through all our reports that we send, so that you've always got the same view. So you're always keeping an eye on those inputs and knowing where those inputs are going. And by making it, actually what I find, it's once you make it simpler and easier to view, it actually leads to better decisions because there's less noise, there's less things going on, so you can see things on a group basis and make sure that overall inputs are where they need to be. So I find that just in my experience, P&Ls can be very overwhelming. I have an example where I saw a client and he presented me 6 pages of the P&L that he'd been looking at for several years. He was a new client. I showed him the same P&L in the view of 6 months and quickly showed him that his wages were way over what he thought they were. He had no idea that they were actually blown out. He thought he was doing well, and in fact, he wasn't doing so well. So if there's too many lines, that can hide the story. The matrix shows the big picture. It's the macro view. It's not the micro view. And it allows you to view a form of a P&L on a daily, monthly, and weekly basis, so that you can always see, where you're heading, where you've come from, where you're heading, and what your end result is likely to be if you keep inputs as they are and all things, remain equal. So always, for me, I always keep sales at the top. So sales is the controller, so it's the 100%. And then the costs flow down. So you have your 4 costs, which I mentioned, which were COGS, wages, variable overhead, and rent. Always express them in percentage term. And then at the bottom is what's the remainder. So 100% and then various percentage that make up, and then the bottom number being profit, which will be the percentage left. This is to me how money actually flows through a venue. You have sales. When you make a sale, immediately COGS come out. Wages, you bought it, and then operating costs and rent are what you need to make sure the place keeps running. So when I'm talking about sales, it's the total revenue generated. It's what the engine of the venue. It's it's what everything else flows from. So every expense that you have must lead to revenue. That's the actual definition of an expense. Really, is that it's a sacrifice to actually that leads to more income. So sales is the starting point. You can't save your way to a profit if revenue isn't there. It's the most important number of the whole thing, and that's why it's the 100%. If I was separating the two, I'd say, well, sales is maybe 60% importance, and all the other things you can separate into that other 40%, with even profit included in that. Because without sales, we're not able to achieve any sort of profit. So COGS, that's what the margin comes into. It's driven by it's the cost of the food and beverage sold. It's driven by pricing, portioning, waste, costs that you pay from your suppliers, and it's managed through buying and menus. So it's something that you can plan based on by product to actually get a certain percentage. It's probably the most easy to plan for, because it's directly that every dollar can have a certain percentage, or every sale can have a certain percentage to attach to it. So wages is the next one. It's the largest controllable cost. So what that means is you've got the most influence over wages. You need wages, of course, because you have to sell, but they are controllable more than any other expense. So and by being controllable, sometimes it needs to go up if there's more sales. Sometimes it needs to go down if there's less sales. You always must align it to sales. And efficiency, sales percentage, and matters much more than cuts. Because you don't want to be cutting wages to a point where you're affecting revenue. You've just cost yourself profit. You haven't gained profit in some cases when you do that. So variable overheads, this is the large group, and it's all the different expenses that you would have that don't make up sales, COGS, and rent. Examples would be utilities, marketing, consumables, entertainment. It's often thought of and heavily focused on, when it's sometimes overlooked, and sometimes it's heavily focused on as something you can control and change. And you can to a certain extent, but it's not a big driver. It's not something you can make a huge impact on. It's definitely COGS and wages, the two most controllable. And then, variable overhead is something you can always try and get better electricity deals, or you can always change marketing spend. But, you don't want to cut that too much because that can affect revenue. You might want to change entertainment split, but that again can affect revenue. So you want to have those quite planned so that you're not change too much, because that's your foundation of what you need to spend to actually drive a lot of that revenue. So it's not a cost cutting exercise. It can be, and it's something you need to control. But if you ignore it completely, you'll actually not miss the context of where your other numbers need to be. So it's the one that needs to be at a certain position, and if you focus on it too much, you'll forget where your COGS need to be, or you'll overlook where your wages need to be. And rent, it's a fixed cost. The only time you generally go up, you've got to maybe have a market review once every 5 years. Generally, can change, depends on your lease, and you might have an increase of CPI or some fixed increase every year. But it's paid regardless of performance. You have to pay it, and it's the most known number that you'll have in all the matrix and all your lines in your P&L. And you must know it. You must understand it, because it's there. It's something you have to pay. So a certain portion of your sales are going to go towards rent. So you want to make sure you're factoring it into the overall mix. And then operating profit is what's left. So that's after all costs are paid for, the sales are there. It's the true scorecard. It's the outcome of all decisions. If there's no profit, then the decisions beforehand need to be adjusted. So we might need to lift sales, or we've got to adjust our costs. And it's very important to understand it's an outcome. It's not something that's directly controllable. The inputs are controllable. The other items in the P&L, this is what's left. And this is, to me, why I like looking at it this way. It removes all the noise. There's so many things going on with different lines, consumables, gas, all these different things. But it just highlights the pressure points. It highlights where we need to go. So it makes it so much simpler to view. So if you focus on this view, and if you need to expand, of course you do. You can group it in different ways, but it's something it shows you really, really where you need to focus on. So I use the matrix always for improvement as an example of why we need to improve. So we can talk about the why is so important. So if we talk about wages are too high or wages are too low, then then we can use the matrix to actually show the why. So there's no argument. It's an objective percentage terms, dollars. It's very simple in the way it looks, and it's very hard to argue with. That someone might say, well, I can't do anything about my wages. Well, then you can point to and say, well, then you need to do something about your sales. So there's always that counter argument. The mix has to be right. Otherwise, you're just making a loss, and we never want that. And it also gives you the opportunity to say, well, what decisions can I make to improve each lever? So, even rent to a certain point you can, if you negotiate your lease well every 5 years, it's something you can look at. But you can do that every 5 years. The other ones you can do much more frequently. So you can separate your decisions and know where you need to improve straight away. So what decisions will impact each item, so that you don't try and do everything all at once. You're not looking at this as a big problem. If you're making a loss, for example, you're looking at, well, where am I going wrong? So you can break that problem down into smaller parts. So just to give you an example, so if we just look at wages at race as one thing we look at, we can break that down into rostering. So rostering gives us that great idea, and we can do some forecasting to see where those wages are going to be. We can review our sales, and we can see whether it aligns, and we can say if we're not aligned, well, we need to adjust in the future. So sales is a real example of something you could really drill down. If you're paying, for example, I've had a simple example like looking at work cover. Work cover is part of wages in the way I report. So sometimes you might see that you're reporting and you've been put into a category where you're paying 2%, and it might be the wrong category, and you should be paying 1%. So there's always a way you can break wages down even further. So controllable, like your super and all that sort of thing, but it's and payroll tax, but it's still something that if you spend, if you put in too many hours in, or if you put in not enough, it's something you can definitely break down that wages. When you're looking at COGS, there's all sorts of things you can look at to say whether COGS are correct. You could look at your sales split. So, look at your COGS first. You can review your pricing. Are we having too much waste? Look at your sales split. So what I mean by sales mix is how much beer are we selling? How much wine are we selling? How much spirits are we selling? Check the margin on each of those items, and is there any way we can change that split? Or can we get customers to move towards having more spirits, which is usually better margin, or more cocktails in the spirit section as well, so it's better margin? Or can we renegotiate beer prices with our supplier? Is there anything we can do? Can we change certain products that have a better COGS? So there's all sorts of things you can do to actually get that COGS to be better and think about. There's all sorts of reporting that you can have on a more of a micro level to actually understand why your COGS where they are, and actually use those tools to actually help improve those COGS. And how I use them, the matrix at PRP, how we use it, it's a diagnosis before we start even advising. So it's something we can look at straight away, every venue will have a very similar format. So you can always separate any venue into these sections. It's something which is so easy to compare amongst venues. It's so easy to diagnose where your problems are. Like if, for example, it's wages, it'll be very, very, very clear. If it's sales, it'll be very clear. If it's COGS, even same thing. And often the best driver of whether your sales are high enough too is just driven by your rent percentage. So your rent percentage, if it's quite high, like I generally think it should be like less than 8%, but if it's higher than that, that means your sales need to go up to give you that split you need. So it drives focused action. It actually tells you where you need to fix things. And that's where, we diagnose what we do first, and we don't just give generic advice. We base it on, what we see in the simple numbers. And my key takeaway, this is the thing I believe with way you report. You don't need to see every line all the time. They're all important, yes, but they all make up a micro view of a macro number. You just need the right view. And if you have the right view, then it becomes clearer. And then you have a better view of the overall picture. And if you've got clearer numbers and clearer things to look at, it can only lead to better decisions that will drive better profit and give you a great profitability mindset so that you can ultimately achieve what you want to achieve in the business and not always be wondering what's going on. Am I making a profit now? Am I not? The Profitability Matrix really gives you that clean snapshot and clean view so that you actually always know whether you are or you aren't, and you always have a great idea of what you need to improve. So just a final point I always make at the end of these videos is that, our profitability partners, we're always improving. We're always striving to improve because I firmly believe that you can't stay the same. So if you're not trying to actively improve, you'll be getting worse. So it's really important to have that improvement mindset and make sure you're always trying to improve. Okay, thanks very much.